Okay, here are the slides. Transformative transdisciplinarity, indeed, a bit of a complex term, but I think we'll get there. And what I want to do, I think I have 30 minutes. You're going to give me like some timer, right? When I'm like up. Great. Let's talk a little bit about a project that I've been running for the past 6 years, which is called Global Epistemologies and Ontologies, or GEOS, which is in its inception a philosophy project. That's why you have all these kind of big words of epistemology and ontology in there, but they look more scary than they are. Epistemology is about knowledge, so we're looking at how people in different parts of the world produce knowledge, validate knowledge, different kind of ways of thinking about knowledge. And ontology is about kind of the way you are in the world, the kind of worldview you have, the way how your knowledge interacts with your practices and your way of being in the world. And again, as you can imagine, people around the world have very different ways of, for example, relating to nature, and their ways of how they produce knowledge about climate issues, environmental issues is very much entangled with their values, their religion, their practices, their cultures, and so on. Now, that's quite philosophical, right? While at the same time, what's I think unique about our project is that we're doing community-based action research. We're not just sitting in the library and philosophizing. So what you're seeing here in the background are 3 of the communities of practice that we've kind of engaged with over the years. On top is our Brazilian team in Salvador in the state of Bahia. The bottom left is the team in Ghana in a little town called Furikram in the center of the country. And in the bottom right is a community in Mexico in the state of Oaxaca. And as the project has grown, there are new teams coming in, for example, in Indonesia and Italy and Colombia. So we've kind of grown a truly global community thinking about knowledge issues and about kind of worldview practice issues. Now, a lot of what I'm saying is, that is not the right one, is based on this book that you see on the right. That's not out yet, but it will be published by the end of August with Oxford University Press and will be open access, so you can just download it. If you're very curious, you can also just write me an email and I send you the manuscript. And there's a shorter version that's published in the Journal of Philosophy of Science. So what I want to talk about is how the kind of projects that we're doing, but also I think a lot of the projects that are people presenting here are kind of part of something that I call the transdisciplinary moment. And I don't think the label transdisciplinarity matters so much. There are a lot of labels that I think you've come across, citizen science, co-creation, co-leadership, co-management, multi-stakeholder approaches, participatory research, participatory action research, participatory design, transdisciplinarity, upstream engagement, and so on and so on. And all these labels, of course, they have different connotations, they have slightly different meanings. They're all part, I think, of a wider trend across natural sciences, engineering sciences, social sciences, of trying to rethink how we're doing science in a way that we're trying to make our research more inclusive and more adapted to the knowledge and the needs of people. Now, what I want to do is situate this kind of transdisciplinary moment and the kind of work that we're doing in kind of 4 steps. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the promises of transdisciplinarity. Why is it that we're doing these kind of co-creation things and what were we hoping to achieve? So that's kind of more the philosophical part, right? The stuff that we're promising. And then I'm going to talk about the reality of transdisciplinarity, talk a little bit about the projects we're running. So that is not just a promise, but there is a kind of a bit of a methodological how. Turns out it's difficult, right? And so the next point is about the failures of transdisciplinarity, the kind of ways in how we tried to co-create, and well, it didn't really work the way we thought we wanted it to work. And then I'm going to situate that a bit broader in a quest for social ecological transformation. Now, in terms of the promises, I do think there's a wider argument that matters. And the wider argument is, well, I mean, first of all, the world is a mess, right? It's like, whether it's climate change issues, whether it's social inequality, whether it's food security issues, whether it's rapid decline of biodiversity, whether it's cultural, political conflicts, and so on and so on. All of these problems, and I think you talked about it yesterday, are entangled with each other, right? They're often called wicked problems because they're so entangled, and we don't have simple solutions to them. Now, in many ways, we're looking to science to come up with better solutions, right? And I think in times of climate change denialism or anti-vax and so on, it's clear that we need to defend the importance of science in these contexts, right? Because how could you possibly, for example, address global decline of biodiversity without proper evidence? Right? But, and there's another side of it, in many ways, the way how science is institutionalized in academia is not just part of the solution, it's part of the problem, right? Many of the scientific innovations, discoveries, technologies are complicit in the production of the very problems they're trying to solve. And we could go over that in all kinds of fields. I'm just going to give you one example, which I think is maybe one of the most straightforward ones, agriculture. Right? Obviously, we need science-based agriculture. Like, world population is growing, food security is still a massive issue in many parts of the world. We need to grow more food, we need to grow more food more reliably in ways that's adapted to climate change, and so on and so on. But at the same time, the global food system is a massive problem in driving the problems that I've been talking about. Right? Whether it's driving climate change, driving biodiversity loss, dispossession of smallholder farmers, creation of large urban underclasses around the world, of people who lose their labor in rural sites, move to the big cities, and so on. Right? And so a lot of that, I think, dilemma that I want to talk about, I think it's most symbolically represented in the so-called Green Revolution. The guy on the top right, Norman Borlaug, is often called the father of the Green Revolution, the only scientist who's ever received a Nobel Peace Prize for his research, because the story was that he saved billions of people from starvation through the development of new, more productive varieties of maize and wheat, the integration with better inputs like fertilizers and pesticides, through mechanization to better value chains, and so on, which kind of rapidly increased the productivity of agriculture in many parts of the world, allowing people to access food more cheaply and more reliably. At least that was the story in the 70s and 80s, right? And now often the story has turned around, and one of the most famous proponents of that is Vandana Shiva, who you see on the slide as well. She wrote this famous book, The Violence of the Green Revolution, based on her fieldwork in India, arguing that in many ways the scientific promises of delivering food more reliably to the poor people turned in the exact opposite, driving dispossession, driving conflict, turning environmental and social disasters based on scientific innovations. Now, if you present the story this way, you can easily end up with an easy pro-science versus anti-science framing, right? Either, we endorse development, modernization, technology, innovation, or we say, oh, they're all evil, they're part of the problem. Now, I think what drives a lot of what I call the transdisciplinary moment is the idea of trying to find an alternative to simple anti-pro-science framings. Yes, we can't trust scientists alone, right? If we only ask scientists what to do, they will, of course, have their own biases. They will not represent, for example, poor people. They will most often not represent the global south adequately, right? They will have their own interests. Their funding will often come from the industry or whatever that has their own interests. No, so we can't trust the scientists alone. We need to kind of produce solutions together with other actors, like community elders, extension workers, farmers, fishers, medical practitioners, policymakers, science communicators, social activists, teachers, union workers. There are many people who have relevant knowledge who need to be included in the production of knowledge and in the production of change in order for change to actually work for people. But transdisciplinarity is also about including them in the scientific process, right? And embracing the scientific process. It's not about rejecting science and only doing indigenous agriculture, for example. It's about how can we bring scientists and all the other actors who are often excluded in science, who have like a massive stake in the innovations and often most clearly affected by them, how can we bring them together to produce something better together, right? So that is I think the transdisciplinary moment that we're in a place of, I think, very obvious social environmental crisis along so many dimensions, where we have to figure out how do we do things differently. Now, I think there are actually often two promises in a lot of the transdisciplinary literature that maybe for kind of more systematic reasons helpful to kind of keep distinguished. On the one hand, there's a kind of what I call the epistemic promise. Diverse people have diverse forms of expertise, right? And so, for example, if you want to conserve a particular ecosystem, right? A scientist who comes from the University of Newcastle to that community, to that ecosystem, has a lot of expertise. But the people who live there in the ecosystem, in the community, they also have expertise, right? And so then the epistemic promise is by bringing different people together who have different types of knowledge, you create more effective and robust interventions. But at the same time, transdisciplinarity, it's not just about being more robust and effective, right? It's also about being more equal and just. And so then part of the story is also, well, it's not just about bringing different forms of expertise together, but it's also about bringing the knowledge and the expertise of people into science who are typically excluded, even if they're most affected by the interventions, right? If a scientist comes up with a conservation plan or an agricultural innovation intervention and it fails, well, then maybe they have like one less fancy publication, right? But for the farmer or for the people who live there, it can ruin their livelihoods. So including them is not just a question of efficiency, it's also a question of justice. Okay, so this much for the general kind of setup of why we're turning to transdisciplinarity and what's promised. Now, the next part was to talk about the reality of this, because as you kind of notice, I talk about this in kind of very general and kind of philosophical terms, and that's nice, and philosophers can, convince you that we need to do things differently and we need to rethink our relations to nature. But then for the kind of more hard-nosed scientists, it's going to be like, yeah, how, right? So how do I translate that into the models that I use, the data I collect, the kind of research setup, right? And so that's where our project has kind of moved from just doing abstract philosophy to doing community-based research itself. And so, as I said, our project is located in different parts of the world. For time reasons, I'm just going to briefly talk about our Brazilian work, where we've been active the longest with two communities called Silibinha and Poças, that you see up there in the northeast of Brazil, who are fishing communities of partly indigenous, partly African descent, where we're trying to work together with the community in addressing conservation issues, addressing livelihood issues, addressing kind of community concerns. And so I think for time reasons I have to be very quick here. You can look up the papers if you're interested in the stuff. For example, one starting point for us was really just to try to document the expertise that people in the community have. And it turns out that there is a lot of very fine-grained knowledge about the ecological mechanisms in the mangrove forest where people live. A lot of the issues, like this phenomenon called robalo waters here, where certain fish appear in the mangroves and apparently randomly, none of the scientists could explain why. While the community members could explain to us like a very complex ecological mechanisms involving tides and moon and the luminescence of the jellyfish and the freshwater inflow when it rains and so on and so on, right? So often the starting point is to take people in the community seriously as people who have knowledge, right? Who are not just kind of passive beneficiaries of your development intervention or your conservation plan or whatever, but who are experts themselves. Right? And then, for example, one way of trying to translate that into concrete benefits for the community for us has been through policy. This is kind of fishery policy, where we interviewed people about Brazilian legislation that doesn't allow the fishers to fish in certain times of the year. That's what you see here in red. And so that those periods are supposed to protect the fish while they lay eggs. The fishers in the community, they told us, and that's what you see in gray, this is when the fish actually lay their eggs. So it has like no positive correlation at all with like the times when they're not allowed to fish. So by incorporating the local knowledge of the fishers, we were able to see that the legislation protects the fish at the wrong time, right? It doesn't protect them when they lay their eggs. And if we would not just rely on the expertise of the academics or the technicians of the government, but also of the community, we could come up with much better rules that would be more beneficial for the fishers, but also more efficient in protecting the biodiversity in the community. We've developed school materials together with the local teachers of the school, so those are kind of comics that the teachers and the kids and us developed together in the community, where we are kind of trying to preserve the local knowledge and expertise that the people in the community have about the ecosystem and integrate it with school knowledge about issues like saline gradients or climate change and so on, right? And so that's kind of a practical way of validating the knowledge of the community, keeping it alive, and bringing it in productive dialogue with kind of academic type of knowledge. Great, so I hope that makes this kind of abstract philosophical talk about epistemic and political promises of transdisciplinarity a bit more clear, right? So we take the knowledge seriously, epistemically, for example, the knowledge of the fishers, about the ecosystem, about when the fish lay their eggs, and so on and so on. And that epistemic part allows us politically to come up, for example, with policy suggestions or with school materials that are actually more beneficial for the community itself and kind of try to at least mitigate some of the negative effects of kind of top-down conservation policy in Brazil. Great. Now, I could end the talk here, and I'm probably almost out of time, right? How am I doing? But I do want to talk a little bit about failures. So this is us, our research team at the last large meeting that we had in Salvador. And so it had been 7 years of us working in the communities. And as the last few slides showed, we have quite a few good stories to tell, right? About kind of best practices and success cases and so on. But I think one thing that often gets forgotten in that is the many ways we fail in these types of co-creation efforts, right? Doing things in a transdisciplinary way is hard. It's really hard. And the idea that you just bring together scientists and communities and everyone's holding hands and making the world a better place, it's just not how it usually works, right? And so I think for us, to do co-creation in a serious way also means thinking about these challenges in a very serious way. And so, well, as you heard, the project was called, or is called Global Epistemologies and Ontologies. So So the challenges that we expected and that we also to some degree found were epistemological, ontological challenges, right? So, for example, you have a scientist working with, let's say, ecosystem modeling, right? Very quantitative approaches and so on and so on. You have a community that also knows a lot about the ecosystem, but relies on like the stories of the elders, has spiritual taboos and things like that. They both may have a lot of expertise about the ecosystem, but their knowledge is structured in such different ways that it's not obvious how you can bring it together, right? And I think that often limits, especially when natural scientists want to do co-creation, they often only pick very little bits and pieces of community knowledge, right? Like, let's say, oh, they have a little bit of useful information about, let's say, let's say a threatened population and where I can find it in the forest, right? Or about how prevalent an invasive species is, right? That's kind of stuff you can prop into your models, right? But when it comes to like spiritual taboos or stories of the ancestors, that doesn't fit in your model, right? So there the epistemological challenge is like, how do you actually bring these knowledges together beyond just kind of nice, fancy philosophical talk of co-creation and transdisciplinarity, right? And then the ontological part is, it's not just about practices of co-creation and knowledge, but also underlying ways of how we think about the world in the first place, right? So for example, a lot of the expertise of the communities that we work with is very much entangled with their ways of spirituality, right? Their ways of kind of thinking about nature, thinking about their livelihood practices in radically different way than secular scientists who come there from Europe. And so, for example, if in Slovenia, sustainability researchers want to look at kind of sustainable management of the mangrove forests, and the community does things kind of in a sustainable way, but there is kind of a creature called kaipora that's kind of a mythical creature that punishes people when they go in the forest and collect too much of the mangrove, right? How do you bring that together? Because kaipora, that mythical creature, that does not fit in a scientific ontology. Right? So those were the kind of the challenges that we expected, and there are also to some degree the challenges that we found. I think one thing that I've learned over the years, that a lot of our actual experiences of failures were much more mundane than that. They were much more about institutional and interpersonal challenges of working together among people who are very different from each other, are in very different positions of power, have very different interests and very different limitations. And so, for example, to start with, I do have another slide on that and so on that. To start with some of the institutional challenges, I noticed that a lot, especially with early career researchers, right? So you're doing like a PhD or maybe even a master. You want to do things better and different in a just equal way. You go to the community and you want to co-produce, but you have funding for 3 months of fieldwork, right? So how do you build relations of trust in 3 months? And how do you fully start understanding each other? Right? You may not have funding to come back afterwards. Right? You may be like, hey, I want to do something that's meaningful for the community, and maybe what's meaningful for the community is kind of developing school materials or coming with some kind of local economic innovation, but that may not be a research question that you're supposed to investigate, right? And how do you balance wanting to do something useful to the community with having to write the papers for your PhD, right? How do you balance your own career interests with the interests of the community when you're there and as a transdisciplinary researcher? All of these things, they're like less fancy than kind of conflicts of different ontologies and epistemologies, but they're very real when you try to do these things in practice. Right? And then the interpersonal skill part as well. A lot of scientists, and I think that includes both natural scientists and philosophers, were much more trained and often much more comfortable to talk about people than with people, right? We don't really have that many skills often to kind of build trust, to build understanding, to make the kind of friendships and the kind of communities that are necessary to co-produce something meaningful together, right? And often we're in very different positions, also socially, economically, right? A lot of scientists who go, especially if it's kind of with disenfranchised communities in the global south, where a lot of our projects work, and you have like a bunch of, professors and PhDs from the Netherlands showing up there. There's so many inequalities, right, in that community. How do you navigate that? How do you actually co-create in an equal way if there's so much inequality in your community of practice? Right? So there are a lot of reasons why transdisciplinarity is difficult. And as much as it is a promise that I think we need to hold on to, and that we need to try to realize as best as we can, we need to, I think, avoid what we started to call the one happy family fallacy, right? The kind of corporate diversity thing where, people of all genders and races are smiling together, holding hands, creating a better world, because that's not how co-production works, right? And the reality is, I think, of a lot of the kind of corporate capture of inclusion talk is that it kind of obscures all these kind of difficulties. And it just allows institutions or scientists to kind of show, hey, look, we're doing things in diverse and inclusive ways. But when you ask, what are you actually producing for the people, right, who are in disenfranchised positions? Often very little can be said, right? So my university, it's great, they're doing a diversity week. But how do the fishers in the community in Brazil or the farmers in Ghana that we work with, how do they benefit from the diversity week on our campus, right? None of them have access to that university. So we need to kind of move beyond kind of superficial diversity and transdisciplinarity talk and recognize the difficulties in order to be able to make a positive difference. Great. That's basically what I said. There's a philosopher, Olufemi Taiwo, who wrote a lot of great stuff about institutional capture. I think that fits right in there. But as I'm out of time, I'm not going to talk more about that. I'm just going to end with some hopeful notes, right? So now I talked a lot about how things are difficult and how we fail and how diversity and transdisciplinarity talk is being captured for institutional legitimation and all of that. And I think it's important to be critical here. But that's not supposed to suggest that we should give up on that. Right? And I do think that the rise of transdisciplinarity and related concepts like co-creation, participatory research, citizen science, and so on, it does reflect a growing ambition, and I think particularly among early career researchers, of doing science differently, right? Of not just kind of going to places, telling people what to do, but trying to figure out how to produce knowledge together with people in a way that's actually meaningful for people, right? And I don't think there's, despite me being a philosopher, and it's kind of always nice to talk about paradigm shifts in science, right? I don't think there's a simple paradigm shift. There's not like a simple, like, this is how we used to do science, this is a new way of doing science, right? But that doesn't mean that we have to accept the status quo, right? And the status quo is often deeply dysfunctional and is deeply complicit in the problems that we have, both environmentally and socially, right? And I do think in our projects we've learned a lot about how to do science in a more just and equal and meaningful way for the community. So I do think even if you have to be prepared for failing again and again and again, it's not that it's all failures, right? Failing is part of the process if you bring people together who are very different from each other, who have very different interests. And it doesn't mean that you can't also succeed in building better communities that actually make meaningful contribution for people and and that actually manage to create knowledge that's more meaningful both for people and the planet as a whole. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much.